Okay, Mr. Mayor, we live.
Thank you. Today is February 1st, 2023. The time is 5:09 p.m. and I'm calling to order the Ballpark City Council special meeting. City Clerk, can I have a roll call, please?
Mayor Estrada.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Garcia. Councilmember Avila. Councilmember Ayala.
Here.
Councilmember Damian.
Here.
Thank you for that, City Clerk. This moment, I will move to open public communications. City Clerk, is there anybody who's looking to speak?
Mayor, we have not received any comments.
Great. At this moment, if there's anybody in the audience who would like to speak and didn't fill out a speaker card, now is your time. Seeing that nobody is looking to speak, I will move to close public communications. And I will move to the open session study session. And I'm going to hand it over to our director, Ron Garcia.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council, staff. This evening's presentation is a update to all the work. If you recall, the city entering into an agreement with the Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles to offer services to those renters who are potentially having difficulty with landlord issues, landlord disputes, given the emergency order that's been placed during COVID. So this presentation tonight is to cover that update of all the work that Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles has provided to residents of Baldwin Park thus far. Trinidad Ocampo will be joining us and presenting via Zoom.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay. Bear with me as technical issues are a feature and not a of kind of what we're doing. Okay. Give me 1 second to present. Let me make sure I can share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So again, my name is Trinidad Ocampo. I'm the Director of Housing and Homeless Prevention Programs at Neighborhood Legal Services of LA County. And I'm meeting with you today to provide an update, housing updates for the city of Baldwin Park. I'm also going to provide some informational background on how county protections have intersected and kind of overlapped some of the Baldwin Park protections, and just kind of give you an overview on the status of our grant. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, Neighborhood Legal Services of LA County is a nonprofit legal aid organization. We operate through LA County and we do not charge for our services. So we are primarily an LSC funded organization, but also receive partnership grants through the state bar, the city, county, and local governments, such as local incorporated cities, such as the city of Baldwin Park. Our work includes training, legal advocacy, and impact and policy work in the issues of housing rights, healthcare access, public benefits, domestic violence and family law issues, immigration, medical, legal, community partnerships, clean slate projects, so that's for justice-involved individuals, and workers' rights. So the Baldwin Park CDBG grant, so this is a build grant. It began in February of 2022. And it ran through March of 2023, or it is intended to run through March 2023. This was a $50,000 grant. And at the beginning, or prior to February, we worked with LA Voice, a local community-based organization, to provide education and training to volunteers and to prepare informational flyers for tenants in English and Spanish. Those were distributed by LA Voice in the campaign to spread information about the Baldwin Park rent stabilization ordinance and the protections that came with it. Since we've begun this grant, we've opened 84 cases across practice areas. 35 housing cases were open. I think as of today, probably closer to 40. We've just seen a recent influx. 22 cases have closed at this point with multiple tenants helped. And I'm going to go through like a breakdown of the primary issues that we saw. At least 5 of those cases were evictions. 10 of those cases were eviction notices where no case had been filed in any court yet. Rent increase notices, issues of relocation, and other issues which include habitability or housing conditions.
Trinidad, before we move on to the next slide, I also want to note. I also want to note that the work that was completed with LA Voice, as you recall, was another agreement with LA Voice to provide and promote and educate the residents regarding this help. And so they were able to reach out to about approximately 340 residents with flyers and information, and being able to refer them to NLSLA. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Yeah. And I will take questions at the end, so that if you do need clarification or want additional information, I'd happy to provide that.
I'm sorry, Trinidad. I'm sorry, Trinidad. I do have one clarification on this particular. It says case overview, 84 cases open in 2022, but then you have 35 cases opened, and 22 of those 35 cases have been closed at this point. So these 35 housing cases, that's separate from the 84 cases in total?
They're part of the 84, but this is 84 Baldwin Park residents, but with family law or other practice areas, so non-housing cases. So of the 84, 35 are housing related.
Got it. Okay. So, wow. So that's a big number that were not housing related.
Yeah. So workers' rights, family law, domestic violence, again, benefits, public benefits issues, people that want any record clearing assistance. So that involves like criminal expungements. So that's all the other types of areas, practice areas that we have.
Clarification.
Sure. Okay. And so challenges to our work. So we did have some issues with the courts. And I will say that, so for Baldwin Park residents that did receive eviction cases, they would have litigated those cases in the West Covina courthouse. There was a bench officer who was assigned to West Covina who was very averse and hostile to any sort of tenant protections, except for those cases where the landlord was paid out through, rental assistance. So for the most part, we lost a majority of the 5 eviction cases. I think we negotiated settlement in 1 or 2 of them, but we lost the others because the court did not agree with those protections and did not, unfortunately, ruled against the tenants in those cases. Other issues that we saw were client cooperation or lack of client engagement. So as part of a CDBG grant, there are a lot of administrative requirements. So we have to collect income verification, we have to collect residency verification, and we have to get a signed intake, an attestation and retainer agreement. Sometimes clients decided that was too cumbersome, and so they didn't want to have to cooperate with those items. The other thing that we found were ineligible clients, and that's due to immigration status or income. We are an LSC federally funded organization, which means that we cannot help people who are undocumented or who are over a certain income limit, so over 200% of the federal poverty level. However, we try to work around that by connecting those clients to our self-help legal access centers that can help anyone, regardless of immigration or income status, landlords and tenants, in fact, and refer those folks to our court-based centers and staff where we have in the Pomona court, the Pasadena court, and other courts that were less accessible to Baldwin Park. Other challenges with the grant. Initially, we had a lot of landlords who were coming to our office for information, and technically they wouldn't qualify based on their assets because they would own usually multiple properties. And so we would refer them to our self-help legal access centers for information. And again, they also, our self-help staff would use the flyers that we created to kind of provide a breakdown and overview of the Baldwin Park rent stabilization ordinance. So we weren't capturing that in those numbers, but we do see a lot of folks who are getting help through our separate centers, but tracked differently. There was limited capacity of LA Voice to organize some tenants. So in some instances, we saw tenants, like there was this one building of over 30 units, and we had 1 or 2 tenants come in, and we were asking LA Voice to help organize the tenants so we could globally resolve, illegal rent increases. But sometimes they weren't able to help necessarily based on their own staffing issues. And so we had to rely on our clients to kind of spread the word or share the information with Baldwin Park tenants. The other thing is that sometimes being involved in litigation or these legal disputes were stressful. And so some clients or tenants chose to leave their units rather than enforce or uphold their rights. And so while, we understand the intent of the city council in trying to preserve tenancies and preserve housing, sometimes we have to act accordingly to the objectives of the clients. And so that is something that we saw. I did want to note some successes as well. Advocacy sometimes for one client sometimes resulted in positive outcomes for many clients. And so if we had one tenant come to us early in the year with an illegal rent increase. So we submitted a demand letter to the landlord, and he actually then rescinded rent increases for the whole building. So even though we only retained one client, that relationship and our advocacy resulted in the impact to 18 families in multiple units of the building. And sometimes that's another way that we work around some of those income and immigration restrictions, is that if we find 1 or 2 tenants, that we can generally write a letter to a property owner or landlord explaining that we represent all the tenants of the building, or we represent the interests of all their tenants in their building. So that is one workaround that we use. We've had relocation paid out where landlords were unaware or previously reluctant to provide such relocation. We've had multiple illegal rent increases rescinded, and we had some evictions averted when the notices that they provided, when they were apprised that those notices were invalid or not legal at the moment, they were rescinded, and so people were able to remain housed. We've also, in those 2 cases that I mentioned regarding habitability, those bad conditions were repaired through our advocacy. So definitely some very positive successes. And as I mentioned, the numbers, don't quite reflect the breadth of the coverage and what our work really did. I'm going to stop there to see if there's any questions. No? Okay. So I'm going to move on. And this is just to talk about the overlapping current housing protections. Baldwin Park, of course, has its rent stabilization ordinance, but the LA County COVID-19 Tenant Protections Resolution also overlaps with that. So currently, all the residents of Baldwin Park are protected by the LA County COVID-19 Tenant Protections Resolution. You also have the Baldwin Park Proclamation that you all established in March, I believe, of 2020, which established a rent freeze for any units covered by the RSO. In addition, you implemented the first supplement to the City Council's order declaring a state of emergency, which protected tenants from evictions for non-payment of rent and for no-fault reasons. Some of these overlap or are duplicative of the county protections, but I will say that because the RSO excludes some properties, the county protections then covered those exclusions. So for example, single-family homes or owner-occupied duplexes, whereas those are not covered by the RSO, those are exemptions. The LA County COVID-19 Tenant Protections Resolution would cover those otherwise excluded properties. So those tenants are being covered at the moment and through March 31st when the county resolution is set to expire. So again, LA County protections, they cover all the areas of LA County, including Antelope Valley, Santa Clarita Valley, San Gabriel Valley, South Bay, San Fernando Valley. I think this is relevant because even within LA County, you have the city of LA. So the city of LA residents are covered also by the county protections, and similarly, Baldwin Park residents are covered by these LA County protections. And so what are the LA County protections and how do they differ a little bit from the Baldwin Park eviction protections? So eviction protections for non-payment of rent have been established through March 31st, 2023, and that's duplicative of your current eviction protections through that First Amendment. The only difference is that the county protection does require a resident to submit a monthly written declaration to the tenant within 7 days of the rent being due. So if the rent's due on the 15th, it's by the 22nd. If the rent's due on the 1st, it's by the 7th of the month. The one difference is that the county protections lapsed for a brief period, and that was due to the state legislation that was enacted that preempted any additional protections that hadn't been enacted prior to a certain date. And so because you had passed that amendment prior to or in March of 2022, your residents were covered. But for any LA County residents who are in a jurisdiction where there was no additional protection, so in El Monte or Rosemead, some of the neighboring communities, if they didn't pay their rent April through June of last year, they could and would be evicted. And so we saw an uptick in evictions generally in LA County because of that lapse based on the state's preemption of that protection from the county. For July through March, these protections apply to households at or below 80% of the AMI, and this is for the county, which is the average median income for LA County, whereas I don't believe Baldwin Park has an income limitation. For the county as well, tenants will have 12 months to pay back any unpaid rental debt, and that's through March of next year. Any questions? No? Okay.
Trinidad, just one clarification.
Yes.
The Baldwin Park's
Sure.
own protection would end at the end of February as opposed to March 31st, correct?
Yes, and then I'm going to get into that, I think, in the next slide.
Okay.
So, all right. All right, so county protections continued. So no fault evictions are restricted through March 31st, 2023, but I believe the Baldwin Park RSO includes no fault restrictions. So no fault means for a tenant to be evicted based on nothing that they did or anything within their control. So for example, if their lease term were to state that it expires on March 3rd, that wouldn't be permitted under the county protections. If a tenant had obtained a pet during the COVID related period, and it was related to some COVID reason because perhaps they brought in a pet from a family member who had to move due to COVID, that would not be the basis, could not be the basis of an eviction. If there were unauthorized occupants, which we also saw with some households, joining together and creating a multi-generational household, to minimize the financial impacts. If it was related to COVID, then that could not be used as a reason for an eviction. If a landlord intended to renovate or demolish a unit, right now that's not a permitted reason for housing provider to evict. And lastly, is a family member move-in. Now, there are some limitations. So for example, in the county, if a landlord intended to have a family member move in, but the tenant is terminally ill or a senior or disabled, the county protections require that family member be similarly situated. So if the landlords then had a tenant who, for example, was a senior citizen and maybe was hard of hearing, which is a disability, they would have to move in their own family member who was also a senior and had disabilities. So it couldn't just be a son or daughter, it would have to be someone who was similarly situated to the tenant. Many of these restrictions are part of the Baldwin Park RSO as well, but as again I mentioned, what was helpful about the county protections was that it applied to tenants in units that were not covered or exempt from the Baldwin Park RSO. This last one I think will capture what was mentioned earlier about related to the expiration of the governor's order, and this relates to the rent freeze and rent increases. So Baldwin Park tenants covered by the RSO should have received no rent increases between 2020 to the present date, and until the city council decides to lift those emergency protections. Baldwin Park, however, tenants not covered by the RSO could have experienced legal rent increases ranging from 8 to 10%. And that was because, for example, single family homes, if they're owned by a corporation, they would be covered under the California Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which caps rent increases based on the Consumer Price Index. So between 2021 and 2022, the CPI was at 8%. But however, because of inflation in 2022, I think in the spring/summer, the CPI increased, and so it led the CPI to increase, which meant that rent increases could go up to 10%. This also reflects back to the governor's state of emergency. So even if a property wasn't covered by the RSO, it wasn't covered by the TPA, the California Tenant Protection Act, which is the state rent control, then the Governor Newsom's state of emergency prohibited price gouging, including rent increases over 10%. Now, because this state of emergency will end on February 28th with the expiration of the governor's order, so too will the rent freeze for Baldwin Park RSO tenants and other tenants in single family homes and other properties that are not covered by the state law, which is the TPA, the Tenant Protection Act. And I hope that provides clarification. And I have to say, it has been challenging working through all these myriad and patchwork of protections that often overlapped and intersected. And so I'll go on. So next steps. So we're hoping to fulfill the terms of our grant agreement through March. So we're continuing to accept cases, work up cases, and advocate for tenants. We're also going to be introducing so at the end of that funding period, we want you to know that the residents of Baldwin Park are still welcome to go to our office and ask for assistance. We'll be implementing a new weekly clinic at our Almonte office. And you can also continue to refer residents of Baldwin Park to our services through our hotline on our website, where we have an online application process. But the walk-in clinic, we're going to be providing a flyer to your office to make it easier for you all to distribute that information to people that are interested. So questions, and I'll stop sharing here.
Yes, hi, I do have a couple of questions. First of all, thank you for the information and the update. You did mention that some of the challenges were ineligible clients due to immigration status and income limits. I don't recall us ever addressing when we were looking into bringing you guys in last year in February, and there was a lot of questions as to how this was going to work. We reiterated that we had a lot of undocumented people in our city that were going to need these protections. Not once did this come up that there wouldn't really be assistance for people with immigration status, or even the mention of income limits. So in other words, anyone who went to you guys for rental assistance, if they were undocumented, they were not assisted in any way, or can you reiterate on that?
Yeah, let me clarify. So again, if there were immigration or income limitation issues, so for example, if we have someone who is not documented, usually the first thing we do is see if there's another household member that's documented, and we make them the primary client. So that was one workaround. As I mentioned before, if we had a building where there was maybe one undocumented but other documented people, like in the instance, we did take on the client that was documented, and we were able to advocate but that impacted all the tenants, whether or not they were eligible for our services. I should also mention that we are separately a member of the Stay Housed Collaborative. And so we also had a referral process whereby any resident who might be ineligible, we would refer to our Stay Housed partners, and those that are assigned to your geographic, to this, that would address residents of City of Baldwin Park, include BASTA and the Eviction Defense Network, which don't have those similar immigration or income. Well, they would have income limitations. For the most part, any legal services provider is going to have an income limitation because these services are intended for the poor, and because the federal government kind of sets the limit at the 200% of the federal poverty level. People that made more money than that sometimes didn't qualify. But again, like I said, we would refer them to our self-help services where they still would receive document preparation, legal information, and assistance in their processes. In the same way, a landlord who wouldn't qualify if they own multiple properties because their assets exceed what is permitted under these federal programs that provide legal services. So I think I should put a star or a caveat next to that. It's not that they don't receive any services, but they may receive something that looks a little bit different. But certainly everyone received referrals. And I want to clarify too that we didn't have rental assistance program as part of this grant, but Stay Housed has its own rental assistance program. And so any resident who signed up through Stay Housed would get connected to an organization that would connect them with those resources.
Got it. And then my last question for you, Trinidad, is you mentioned that out of the 35 housing cases open, 22 of those closed. So that means that there was 12 that were still left open.
Yeah, so there's a few that we're still working on with landlords who are resistant to this idea that either that they can't raise the rent right now, or that I think in one instance we have a group of tenants where their landlord uses an online payment portal. And after we reflected, we advocated and said, okay, these rent increases are legal. They're like, okay, we got it. We won't charge that. We'll revert back to the old rents. And tenants have informed us, yes, we're paying the old rent, but we're still waiting on the landlord to adjust the portal, which reflects the old rent increase amount, the illegal rent increase. And so we keep those open until everything gets resolved. And so that's one of them. In one of the other buildings, we're also still collecting information from tenants so that we can advocate building wide to ensure that everyone got the same rent increase. Otherwise, we need to provide different letters for different clients depending on the variations in rent increases for each client. So that's kind of, that advocacy is ongoing, I should say.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Trinidad, not so much a question, but just part of the timing for bringing you to make this presentation, as Ron, you and I and our city attorney discussed, is that the sunsetting of the protections, there's the part you covered already. At the end of February, the city's own protections will sunset because of the end of the governor's emergency order. The county will extend the protections through the month of March 31st. But following March 31st, there will be evictions for non-payment will resume, and rent increases, whether they're covered under our RSO or not, those will also resume, which we would anticipate an awful lot of requests for assistance on the part of the city, and we wanted for the council to think about that. We would like to come back to the council with a recommended action, perhaps whether it's NLSA or anyone else, including whether LA Voice is included, with regards to continuing the services. And perhaps if we are able to avoid the funding eligibility impediment, Councilmember Damian, with regards to not being able to help and assist non-citizens or non-residents, then we would be looking for a color of funding that does not have that restriction, which can be general fund or something else. So we don't have any of that figured out per se, but we would like to know if the city council would be interested in us coming back in time before the expiration of the county's protections, which would be March 31st. So sometime in early March, we would, or at the latest, the second meeting in March, we could come back to the city council with a recommendation.
Thank you, Enrique. In addition to the comments that you've made, I want to stress that the work that LA Voice provided has come to a close. That agreement only lasted the first half of 2022. They did the outreach, and so once that concluded, that then was put on our administrative staff to refer those to NLSLA. So NLSLA has been integral in assisting staff with helping Baldwin Park residents work through these issues. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's definitely important that we keep an eye on this. I know a lot of residents still keep reaching out about their rights and what's possible for them and their independent situation. We also want to make sure that we're advertising it on our social media channels, that there is help for them, that they can call this number, and then we can work on that. And I do think it's important that we revisit the issue. We do have a renter rate of at least 45% here in the city, which means almost half, if not half, of our residents, or even more, are vulnerable during these times. So we want to make sure that we keep that stability going for them. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns? If not, I believe at this point we are at the ending point of our presentation. Trinidad, thank you for being with us today and giving us all that great information. Of course, Ron, thank you for working on this.
Thank you for having me.
At this moment, we will move to recess to closed session, and we will see everybody after that.